The storm clouds hung low over the forest, swallowing the moonlight and turning the world into a cavern of black shadows. A chill wind threaded through the towering pines of Black Hollow, making the branches creak and groan like tortured bones. Lacy, Jack, Sarah, and Mark trudged through the thick underbrush, their boots sinking into mud and leaves slick with rain. They had heard the rumors about the cabin deep in the hollow, how anyone who entered never returned, but curiosity, or maybe foolish bravery, had drawn them here. Each step they took seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound bouncing between trees like whispers from unseen mouths. As they neared the cabin, a smell hit them, metallic and sickening. The ground was littered with what appeared to be old human remains, dry, cracked bones, shredded flesh, and patches of congealed blood darkened to black over time. Mark stumbled over a femur, recoiling as a thin layer of dried sinew clung to his shoe. "Guys, maybe we shouldn't go in," he muttered, voice tight with unease. Lacy, whose curiosity was unrelenting, glanced at the cabin looming through the trees. Its windows were dark, framed by rotting wood, and its walls bore deep scratches that suggested more than weathering. "It's too late to turn back now," she said, her teeth clenched. "Let's see what's inside." The four of them stepped onto the creaking porch. The floorboards groaned under their weight. As they reached for the door, they noticed the walls were streaked with dried blood, forming jagged patterns, almost like crude messages left by someone or something. Lacy pushed the door open, and a rotten odor hit them instantly. A mixture of mildew, death, and something far fouler that made their stomachs twist. The cabin interior was worse than they had imagined. The floor was slick with a dark, sticky substance that glinted in the faint light. They realized it was old, congealed blood, shards of broken glass, bits of shattered wood, and scattered bones littered the ground. In the corner, a figure lay slumped, unnervingly still. Its eyes were open, glassy and unseeing, the mouth frozen in a silent scream, and patches of decomposed flesh clung to its skull like grim ornaments. The air seemed to thrum with an unseen presence, heavy and oppressive. A soft scraping echoed from the other side of the room. Sarah froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound came again, closer, like claws dragging across the floorboards. Jack's flashlight flickered, casting long, quivering shadows that danced along the walls. The figure in the corner appeared to shift, though its body should have been stiff with decay. Lacy swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step forward. "It's just the wind," she said, though her voice wavered. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering the roof, making the creaking worse. Suddenly, Jack let out a strangled yell. His arm had gotten caught in a rusted metal hook embedded in the floor. He struggled, pulling, but it dug into his flesh, tearing at the skin. Blood began to drip from the wound, bright red against the dull brown of the floor. He screamed again, louder, raw terror cutting through the cabin. Sarah rushed to help, but as she reached for him, a dark, shifting shadow darted from the corner, slamming Jack to the ground. He writhed and kicked, but the shadow held him fast, dragging him across the blood-streaked floor as his screams echoed off the walls. The shadow was fluid, almost human in shape, but darker than the darkness around them, and when it moved, it left a smear of deep, blackened blood behind. Lacy and Sarah stumbled back in horror. They clutched each other, hearts pounding, every instinct screaming to run, but the cabin seemed to expand and contract around them. Every room they looked into twisted in ways that made no sense. One moment the doorway led to the main room. The next it opened into a hallway that had not existed seconds before. The walls were alive with marks, scratches deep enough to expose raw wood beneath, some still wet with fresh, glistening blood. From somewhere deep in the shadows, came faint whispers. Almost human, almost pleading, but impossible to understand. They were accompanied by the soft thud of footsteps that didn't match their own. Every hair on their arms stood up as if electricity coursed through their skin. They pressed on into the next room, floorboards groaning and giving way in spots. There, they found Mark slumped against the wall, his face pale, lips stained with blood. A long gash ran from his temple to his jaw, flesh torn and ragged. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling wet sound came out, punctuated by little splashes of blood as he coughed. Lacy reached to help him, but before she could touch him, the floor beneath them shifted, giving a sudden jolt, and Mark slid away like a rag doll into the darkness. His screams echoed, cut short by a wet, sickening, tearing sound. Lacy and Sarah fell to their knees, trembling, their lungs burning with panic. The air in the cabin grew heavier, thicker, almost viscous, and the scent of blood and decay became overpowering. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, breathing, expanding slightly, closing in as if the cabin were alive. Sarah's flashlight illuminated a wall that hadn't been there moments ago. Handprints pressed into the wood, fingers splayed, smeared in fresh, red blood. Above them, scratches formed words, letters gouged roughly into the beams. "You shouldn't be here." The whispers grew louder, layering over each other, a chorus of tormented souls screaming silently, each tone more desperate than the last. Jack's screams had stopped. The cabin returned to a haunting silence, broken only by the storm outside. Lacy and Sarah clung to each other, slowly backing toward what they hoped was the exit. But the doorway before them now led to a room completely unfamiliar, its floor soaked in blood and littered with fragmented bones. The fragments were unmistakably human. Fingers, small ribs, pieces of skull, but they seemed almost fresh, glistening wet and slick under the flashlight's beam. A cold, invisible hand seemed to brush past Lacy's shoulder, making her gasp. Shadows writhed along the walls, forming shapes that almost resembled people in agonizing poses. They reached the last room at the far end of the cabin, gasping for air. This room was worse than anything they had seen. A large pool of blood covered the floor, thick and black, rippling slightly as if something stirred beneath the surface. In the center, a pile of bodies, or what had once been bodies, lay twisted together, limbs broken at unnatural angles, faces frozen in terror, eyes staring into infinity. The sight made Sarah retch violently, vomit streaking her shirt, and the coppery smell mixed with the stench of rot, making it unbearable. The pool of blood began to ripple again, small tendrils of darkness curling toward them, and a wet, sucking sound filled the room, as if the cabin itself were drawing life from the remains. Desperate, Lacy grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward a corner for shelter. The room seemed endless, each wall a mirror of death, gore, and whispered torment. They could feel the eyes of the cabin on them, unseen hands brushing their arms, cold breath against the back of their necks. Every heartbeat sounded deafening in the silence between the storm's thunderclaps. They sank to the floor, clutching each other, waiting, praying, as shadows shifted in the corners. Something moved near the ceiling, droplets of blood falling onto their skin, each one sizzling as it touched. The cabin had claimed Jack and Mark. They were gone. And now, Lacy and Sarah had no choice but to face the living nightmare that had been waiting for them the moment they stepped inside. The cabin seemed to pulse with life, or perhaps death itself, breathing with a rhythm that matched Lacy's pounding heart. She and Sarah clung to each other, backs pressed against a wall, slick with dried blood. The faint light from their flickering flashlight barely illuminated the horrific scene around them. Bits of bone and gore littered the floor, slickening the wood beneath their knees. The pool of blood in the center of the previous room had spread, running like dark rivers into every corner. Shadows moved independently of the light, creeping along the walls, stretching and shrinking in impossible ways. The air was thick, oppressive, and metallic with the stench of iron and decay. A wet, sucking sound echoed through the cabin, and Lacy's stomach lurched as she realized it came from the floorboards. She peered into the black liquid, pooling beneath the nearest broken floorboard, and saw a hand, pale, bloated, and impossibly twisted, emerge, fingers curling and flexing, as if the body beneath it were trying to climb out. Sarah shrieked, covering her eyes, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the cabin's walls. Then a low guttural moan rolled through the air, vibrating through their bones. Something, or someone, was coming for them. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the far wall and lunged. Lacy barely had time to grab Sarah before it collided with them, its form impossibly tall and dark, dripping a mix of blood and shadows as it moved. The thing's fingers elongated into sharp, jagged claws, gouging the wall and floor as it advanced. Lacy could hear Jack's scream from earlier in her mind, a memory that twisted into a fresh wave of terror. The shadow's presence pressed down on them like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand striking a pool of blood, and her vision blurred as she realized it was alive with small, twitching shapes, bits of torn flesh, writhing as if they were still part of a living organism. Mark's absence hit them like a punch. They could hear his ragged breathing from somewhere deep in the cabin, distorted and wet, and then it stopped. Silence fell, only for a moment, before a sickening tearing sound cut through the air. Lacy could only imagine what had become of him, and bile rose in her throat. The cabin itself seemed to pulse in response, floorboards bending, walls expanding, whispers flooding from every corner in high-pitched, desperate tones. "You can't leave! You can't leave! You can't leave!" The two girls stumbled into the next room, but their escape was futile. The doorway twisted before their eyes, elongating like it was alive, closing off the exit they had just come through. Blood ran in streams from the walls themselves, dripping from ceiling beams and splattering onto the floor, forming gruesome, shifting patterns of human faces, screaming silently. Lacy's hands shook as she tried to wipe her flashlight, only to reveal a face pressed into the wall, eyes wide, mouth open in a frozen scream, skin peeling and bloody. The smell of iron and rot choked her, forcing her to gag. Sarah vomited again, streaking the floor with bile that mingled with blood, the smell making their stomachs twist further. Something moved in the corner, a small, wet shuffle that crawled across the floorboards. Lacy froze, heart in her throat, as a limp, blood-soaked arm reached out from the darkness, twitching unnaturally, fingers grasping blindly. She screamed, grabbing Sarah, and they bolted to the far side of the room. But the cabin had other plans. Shadows erupted from the walls, colliding with them, scratching their arms and face, drawing lines of fresh blood. The walls themselves seemed to bleed, droplets forming hands that stretched toward them, like the dead were trying to escape the cabin entirely. The moaning grew louder, and from the darkness, a figure slowly emerged, dripping with blood and gore. It was Mark, or what had been Mark. His face was unrecognizable, half of it mangled and raw, flesh hanging in tatters. His eyes were gone, leaving empty sockets, but he was moving, limping, staggering forward, one arm dragging behind him, the other reaching as if to pull them into his nightmare. Lacy tried to stop, but she couldn't move fast enough. The smell of his decaying flesh and blood enveloped her, making her retch violently. He let out a sound, neither fully human nor animal, a wet, gurgling screech that shook them to their core. Sarah tried to push him back, but her hands passed through the shadow of his body, as if it were both solid and insubstantial. Lacy realized then that whatever had claimed her friends, whatever had been feeding off their bodies, was not bound by the rules of reality. The cabin itself was a predator, and they were prey. The walls undulated again, groaning, expanding and contracting. Shadows flitted across the ceiling, some resembling twisted, screaming faces, others long clawed hands reaching for them. Blood spattered from above, streaking their hair and clothing. Lacy could feel tiny writhing things crawling across her skin, the remnants of previous victims, trying to claim her as well. Desperation fueled their escape. They scrambled toward the front of the cabin, but the doorway they remembered was gone, replaced by another room entirely. This one was smaller, tighter, and worse. Bodies were stacked in a pile in the center, limbs twisted at impossible angles, torsos split open, ribs jutting through skin, blood oozing like molten metal. The pile writhed slightly, small limbs moving, heads twitching. A scream, wet and muffled, came from inside it, echoing across the room. Lacy and Sarah fell to the floor, pressed into a corner, unable to move. The smell was unbearable, and the air pressed down on their lungs. The shadow that had dragged Jack reappeared, slithering along the floor toward them, leaving a trail of black, congealed blood. It reached out with clawed fingers, grazing Lacy's shoulder. Pain exploded along her skin, and she screamed. The shadow's tendrils coiled around her arm, pressing, tearing, and burning like acid. And she felt something, some horrible, cold, living presence, sink inside her flesh. Sarah tried to pull her away, but the weight of the darkness pressed both of them into the floor, crushing, suffocating. And then, in the briefest moment, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the blood pooled, the shadows froze. Lacy and Sarah were breathing hard, faces streaked with blood and tears, clothes torn and saturated with gore. They slowly raised their heads. At the far end of the room, the front door creaked. Lacy dared a glance outside. Dawn's pale light seeped into the cabin, thin and hesitant, illuminating the nightmare in stark detail. Every surface was drenched in the aftermath of horror. Bodies, twisted, broken, and lifeless, or half-living, stared at them. The cabin had let them survive, but only for a moment. As they stumbled toward the door, hearts pounding, the shadow appeared once more, rising taller than the cabin itself, dripping with blood from every limb. Lacy froze. It whispered. Its voice, wet and sickly. A voice like rotting flesh, scraping across bone. Now you are mine. Forever. Its clawed hand extended toward them, fingers slick and glistening with blood. Lacy felt Sarah's grip slip as the darkness surged. Panic threatened to overtake her mind. The doorway beckoned, promising escape, yet she knew the cabin's horrors would not let them go willingly. With one final, desperate effort, Lacy grabbed Sarah and pushed toward the sunlight, staggering out of the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the forest eerily silent, but the moment they stepped onto the wet earth, Lacy glanced back. The cabin stood, silent and still, or so it appeared. The shadow, the bodies, the blood, all gone, yet the air felt alive with menace. And in the doorway, faintly, a dark figure lingered, its hand raised, dripping with blood, whispering her name. The memory of Jack and Mark, of all the dismembered bodies, would haunt her forever, and she knew deep down that the cabin had not released them. Not truly. She and Sarah had escaped physically, but the nightmare of Black Hollow would follow them forever.
Please like and subscribe channel Fear Frequency for more horror stories. Thank you.